community and are mentally ill.
But Marjorie Wallace's contention is that despite the institution of a care plan so that when a patient comes out of hospital they are supervised by a key worker, the system is simply not working now. Despite all the assurances from the government and so forth, you can't do any better.
Certainly the people who are at the front line, at the cutting edge of helping to protect people in the community and care for the community, care for patients in the community, are quite clear that they do need the resources, they do need the support. I think certainly we need very much to listen to and respect the views and wishes of family. But I think, and to that extent, I'm very much at one with Marjorie Wallace. I think where I would move away from her position is where I sense that the argument is one being polarised into one of either there are sufficient beds or there aren't sufficient beds, and if there were sufficient beds, this problem wouldn't occur. I find that difficult to cope with.
Well, Marjorie Wallace's point, though, would appear to be that today, even after she came back from the Old Bailey, there were cases similar to Mrs. Collins, where the social services put up their hands and said there's nothing we can do about it.
There will be such cases. There will be anyone who is in the business of responding to people's distress will hear of such cases, will hear of it on a constant basis. What there is also, though, is the vast number of mentally ill people in the community who are properly cared for, adequately cared for, and who would be ill-served if we responded to their needs by simply saying, we play safe and lock them up.
Can I come in here? I just talked to the doctor in charge of the Wayne Hutchison case, and he was saying to me that the question is of beds. There was no medium secure unit to be found. There was no beds to be found. He said it all boils down to the fact that there are no beds available. We're running at the moment at 100% all over the country, 140%, that's 14 people to 10 beds within the country. And what can you do? Because if you keep somebody like Wayne Hutchison in the hospital, what are you going to do with the others who are coming, knocking on the door, equally vulnerable? The question is that we're running down the beds, we're hell-bent on losing psychiatric beds. At the same time, we're not supplying the same kind of supervision in the community.
But you say there's not the supervision, but you must welcome under this care plan the idea that there would be a key worker assigned to each mentally ill patient.
Of course, if that key worker is sufficiently trained in mental illness, but if you talk to any psychiatrist, the few nurses that are actually trained in mental illness, the few people who can actually make proper assessments, the problem is that we have not gone in for a proper supplement to the closure of the psychiatric hospitals. We're not training people, we're not building up alternatives. If we did that, we could manage. What can you do if you go out for an assessment and you find that somebody's neglecting themselves, that they're threatening their parents? What do you do if there's no place for them?
Mr. Walsh, would your assessment be, though you don't think that the closures are the primary problem, to halt the closures immediately?
Clearly, closures are a problem and have been a problem, will continue to be a problem. I'm glad to hear Marjorie Wallace say that, in fact, the preferred option is to make absolutely sure that the social workers, nurses, those people who are looking after people in the community are equipped, trained, they have the resources and are able to make the judgments, to make the calculation as to who properly can be cared for in the community. And when they make the decision that someone cannot be properly cared for in the community, that they are able to count on adequate resources. And if that's beds, then of course that's beds.
But what do you say to Marjorie Wallace's point? The problem is there isn't the level of training necessary to deal with the complexities of the problem that mental patients often offer.
Clearly, we are unequal to the task at times. That's obvious. Obvious from today's events. It's also obvious, and I can bear witness to the fact that we are getting better. We are getting better. Training is getting better. People are getting better trained. That's not to say that there is a sufficiency or that we've got there.
Thank you both very much indeed. And we should point out that we actually asked the Department of Health for a minister, but to no avail. Nobody was available tonight. In a moment, the ethical debate over the practice now halted of keeping the dying alive on ventilators so their organs can best be used for donation. But first, some of today's other news stories. The governor of Holloway Prison is being moved from her job just weeks after inspectors walked out of the jail in protest at what they called unacceptably low standards. Janet King is going to prison service headquarters. The inspectors found shortfalls in treatment of prisoners and conditions and an overzealous security regime. The government has decided against selling off the Admiralty Arch, the historic naval buildings in central London. Plans to float the landmark had been fiercely criticised by the Admiral of the Fleet, Lord Hill Norton, who called the Defence Secretary, Michael Portillo, a little creep. The embattled Russian Foreign Minister Andrei Kozyrev has resigned to take up his seat in the Russian Parliament instead. Kozyrev has been under pressure to go from nationalist opposed to what they saw as his pro-Western stance. A woman who was pronounced dead and then taken to Hitchingbrook Hospital in Cambridgeshire in a body bag was found to be alive by mortuary attendants as they were putting her in a refrigerator. 61-year-old Daphne Banks is now said to be making a satisfactory recovery. The American Congress and the White House have taken a breather in their fight over the budget, which has shut down government. The House of Representatives has voted to return federal employees to their desks, but not to give them the money to carry out programs. And the markets, the 100-share index closed 9 points down at 3704. While in New York, the Dow Jones closed 8 points up at 5181. The pound dropped 1/10 of a penny against the Deutschmark at 2 marks 228, and on Wall Street, the pound closed unchanged at $1.55. Should doctors be able to keep a dying person alive just to ensure their organs are in good condition for transplant? That's the dilemma that's being considered this month by members of the Medical Royal Colleges. There is a system known as elective ventilation, which involves connecting dying patients to machines which do not benefit them, but will keep their organs fresh. Some hospitals were doing this as a matter of course, until the government pointed out it was probably illegal. With the desperate shortage of organs, on average 5 people a week die awaiting transplants, doctors are looking at ways of maximising the number of organs available and are considering whether elective ventilation should become common practice. They'll decide by the end of the month. Simon Willis looks at the ethical and moral minefield they're delving into.
It is an issue of life, of death, and of a twilight world between. Organ donors almost exclusively come from intensive care units. Patients who die on general wards are rarely suitable because their organs deteriorate before they can be removed. Machines can delay the process, keeping oxygenated blood pumping around a body hours after the patient has died. But is it ethical to connect a dying patient to such a machine, which cannot benefit them, simply to keep their organs fresh for transplant?
We don't want it to be looked at as body snatching, but as life-giving. The recognition that someone's situation of disaster can actually be the key to the door of hope for another patient.
The single most powerful argument against resorting to elective ventilation is that the patient isn't dead. And you shouldn't use a means on patients as if they were dead and not designed in any way to benefit them until when they are still living and deserving of our respect as living patients.
This is how her family will remember Winifred Mitchell. 2 years ago, she suffered a massive stroke and was rushed to Exeter Hospital, but doctors could do nothing. Her death was inevitable. Because she carried a donor card, her family gave permission for her to be moved from a general ward to intensive care. When Mrs. Mitchell stopped breathing, she was ventilated, and once she'd been confirmed brainstem dead, her kidneys were removed.
We feel that, if this was the last thing that she could have done, then that is what she would have wanted, to have helped somebody else. Everything was done for Mum that could have been done for Mum. They did all that they could do, and our feelings were that if someone else could benefit, all right, Mum had to be artificially ventilated, but if somebody else could benefit, then that was great, for want of a better word, but at least somebody else benefited from Mum's death.
But in October 1994, the Exeter team and others around the country were told by the Department of Health elective ventilation was probably unlawful and had to stop. Technically, the act of putting a dying patient on a ventilator could amount to an assault because it is not in the best interests of that patient. What's more, no relatives can give consent on their behalf. And so the situation has remained for over a year. But now a growing number of doctors, increasingly backed by the medical establishment, are convinced it's time the law was changed in favour of elective ventilation.
Right, Graham, here we are. There's your kidney, this is it down here.
It's 3 weeks since Graham Harding was given his new kidney. Helping transplant patients make a full recovery is part of the job of renal physician Anthony Nichols. He's one of the Exeter team which pioneered elective ventilation, a technique used for 6 years until it was stopped in October 1994.
We first of all determine whether that person would have wished their organs to be used. And so in some sense it's like honouring a will. If the next of kin know that their mother wished the organs to be used for transplantation and we honour that wish, one could argue that's in their best interests. The law doesn't see it in those terms, but at human level we believe that we're honouring their best interests. We certainly don't believe we're doing any harm. We don't interfere with the fact that they're actually dying because we only put them on a breathing machine when they actually stop breathing.
In the 6 years, the Exeter team moved dying patients into their intensive care unit to ventilate them when they stopped breathing. They gained 21 extra donors, from whom 41 additional kidneys became available for transplant, along with 2 hearts, 3 sets of heart valves, 1 liver and 20 corneas. Since elective ventilation stopped, the annual number of kidney transplants has almost halved.
How have you been feeling recently?
Very well.
All right.
Yeah, very well.
3 times a week for the last year and a half, Bill Mallett has come to hospital to have his blood cleaned.
Yeah.
Kidney dialysis is very expensive compared to transplantation, but because donor kidneys are scarce, 5,000 people are waiting like this. Indeed, over the last 10 years, while the number of kidney transplants has remained more or less constant, the number of patients waiting has almost doubled. Elective ventilation could bring supply closer to demand, but there is a huge fundamental objection to its use.
We don't like it because it is not benefiting the individual that doctors have been trained to treat, care for and manage.
This is more than a personal objection to elective ventilation by Dr. Sheila Willits, a consultant in an intensive care unit. It's a legal one too.
There is no benefit in taking a patient to an ITU for that patient. The care that would be delivered under those circumstances could be described as futile care. It will not benefit that patient. We don't like it. We don't want our resources to be used for this when they could be used for the benefit of an individual. But on the other hand, you cannot deny the fact that a number of people could benefit from this practice.
And that's the dilemma that all
That's
medical
the
staff find
dilemma.
themselves. And it's not the only dilemma. What if a dying patient was placed on a ventilator but did not die? The part of the brain which gives consciousness might stop working, but the most resistant part, the brain stem, which is tested to confirm death, might still show activity. The risk of inducing this condition, which is known as a persistent vegetative state, is small, and it didn't happen in Exeter.
But it is a recognised possibility when you intervene with patients with other forms of brain injury, such as head injury, subarachnoid hemorrhage, that if you do intervene and ventilate, then this is a possible outcome. It is mercifully very unusual, but it is quite a catastrophic outcome. And if it does happen, then I think the whole morals and ethics of interventional ventilation would have to be redebated.
Despite these arguments and its dubious legality, elective ventilation almost certainly continues. It is left to a doctor's clinical judgment to decide whether a dying patient will benefit from being put on a ventilator. If they can justify that decision to themselves and their colleagues, then there's nothing and no one to stop it.
We are surprised that throughout intensive care units there is a variation in how patients get into intensive care units with brain hemorrhage. Various doctors are interpreting criteria for admitting people with seemingly hopeless brain injury to intensive care units, where in the heart of hearts they must believe there's no chance for the patients, and it is purely for organ donation, but they're not actually stating that.
Is that why you think this needs to be cleared up?
Yes. I think in some ways we have been penalised for being totally honest in our approach.
The medical establishment also realises the present confusion cannot continue. Recently, the Medical Ethics Committee of the British Medical Association decided to support a change in the law to allow elective ventilation in cases where people have indicated they want to become organ donors.
It's not something that we as a society have looked at. We find it very difficult to face, and doctors are no better than anybody else, to face the fact of our own mortality. And yet, within what is for us an irrecoverable situation, we, because of the brain damage, we still have the potential to give life to 2, 3 other people. And life of a good quality now with what transplant surgeons are able to do. And I think that that recognition, and that is an ethical approach to give life when we can, is one that has moved the committee to feel that the law should be changed.
With growing establishment support, members of the British Transplantation Society believe that change could soon happen. Their discussion document is now being considered by each Medical Royal College. Their collective policy will be decided soon.
They'll be crucial, because what that will give us is the opinion of all the Medical Royal Colleges in the United Kingdom.
And how much weight will that carry?
Enormous weight.
They're the principal advisors on medical practice to the government.
Do you think it will be enough to make the Department of Health change their mind on this, or even alter the law?
I think they will listen to the Conference of Colleges, and then they will make up their mind accordingly.
They argue elective ventilation could be made a special exemption, but even the slightest change in the law could have unforeseen ramifications. Death is a process, and a dying patient is quite different to a dead one. If the law permits the ventilation of a dying patient for reasons other than their own good, that could be an important symbolic stance. Could it permit someone who is not dead to be treated as if they were?
5 years down the line, circumstances might arise where you have a patient who is terminally ill or very ill, not likely to do very well, and you may wish to, for example, to carry out certain research on drugs. Not for this patient, won't benefit this patient, but it'll allow us, quote unquote, to make a breakthrough. And you could look back to this law and say, well, it might facilitate this as well. And so there is always the danger that the law might be used, I hate to use the expression, but it's commonly used as a thin end to a particular wedge, namely an increasing disrespect of the rights of those who are dying.
I really don't think there is any possibility of that. I mean, this has been very much under the microscope. It's been considered from every angle, and I don't think there is any question of this being the thin end of the wedge. This is, if you like, the very far end of the wedge. This is a way of improving what has already been underway for a long time.
In a situation where the transplant team is in favour, the intensive care team is in favour, the patient's relatives are in favour, the patient wanted to be an organ donor, I think in that situation, if for the law to step in and say, no, we don't want this person to be an organ donor, I think that's just tragic.
Winifred Mitchell's family are firmly convinced that they did the right thing, what Mrs. Mitchell herself would have wanted. But it is unsettling for them to know that they might have agreed to an unlawful act. The medical community is accustomed to argument and to resolving complex ethical issues. But until the law catches up with what many professionals consider to be natural justice, then elective ventilation will not be carried out. Officially, at least.
That report from Simon Willis. Tomorrow morning's front pages now. Daily Mail goes with stalkers' love notes to Anne, Princess Royal. Daily Express, fanatics' love notes to Anne. The Guardian goes with leaked memo reveals conspiracy to silence Saudi dissident Mazari, arms boss secret plot. The Independent, lottery mania, it asserts, unites the nation. And they also a story of Vickers director, Iron Man in Saudi, the non-executive director of Vickers. And The Times, £110 million staked in the biggest gamble yet. That's all from Newsnight tonight. Jeremy will be back with more on Monday. Until then, from all of us in the programme, a very good night.
These people have something on their minds.
I think the basis for a loving relationship is not obsession.
What is love?
I increasingly think that it's a very dangerous word.
Are we happier now?
There are just about the same ingredients for happiness as there ever were.
How serious is overpopulation?
As soon as you educate people, they want a BMW rather than a third child.
4 of the finest thinkers discuss the questions on all our minds in a new series of The Brains Trust, Monday, 11:15 on BBC2.